Hola amigos, Ghost here, and today we continue our bonus Bookends series on Ghost of Tsushima. In today's Bookends, we shall discuss the aftermath of the Mongol invasions of Japan and their dire consequences that would directly or indirectly cause the fall of both the Mongols' Yuan Dynasty of China and the Kamakura Shogunate of Japan. With that, let us return to the past. Let's do this! Our story continues with the disastrous conclusion of the two Mongol invasions of Japan. The first invasion had ended with mild military success for the invaders, but severe weather forced its withdrawal, not to mention that it was logistically untenable to continue the invasion. After these results, Kublai Khan's attempted second round of diplomacy failed, as the Khan failed to realize that Japan would rather fight to the death than submit. The second invasion was meant to remedy the first's conclusion by being larger and stronger, but instead it would end up being a bloated force hampered by logistics, disease, weather, and a formidable enemy. The second invasion came too early to exploit the Mongol Empire's strengths and too late to exploit the Japanese's inexperience to Mongol tactics. Enough time had passed, which allowed Japan to learn from the first invasion and prepare for the second one. The Japanese denied the Mongols their strengths while bleeding them dry. Even when the invaders marched into Kyushu's countryside, they faced bloody stalemate after bloody stalemate. All of this placed the invasion in the right place at the right time for its undoing. Divine or not, the great storm that came wrecked the Mongol fleet so spectacularly that the invasion ended right there and then. The second invasion ended in a complete disaster, and with it, the first domino in the chain of events leading to the fall of dynasties had fallen. For the Mongols' Yuan dynasty, the disastrous end to the invasions left a permanent black mark on its power and legitimacy in Asia. It would take Kublai Khan the rest of his life to repair the damage from his own hubris. And even then, the damage would spread through other means and slowly but surely weaken the empire. In the days and months after the second invasion, those that survived it would return to China and Korea and face humiliation for their great failure. The common soldier and sailor continued their service to the empire or retired to their homes. For many officers and generals, they would face worse punishments, from demotion and imprisonment to execution or exilement. The Yuan dynasty's naval power would be greatly diminished due to the sheer losses of sailors, officers, and ships. However, the navy would continue to play an important role in the future. The weakening of its navy would allow pirates and raiders, including vengeful Japanese ones, to cause havoc among the empire's coastal settlements, ports, and trade routes. The empire's tributary Korea would suffer the worst from this, as its shipbuilding industry was crippled after the invasions, as they had taken a vast portion of Korea's wood stockpiles and forests to build the invasion fleets. Thus, Korea could not help the empire or build ships to the degree needed to defend themselves. The cost of the invasions added to the empire's financial difficulties. Since 1279, the empire's treasury was becoming smaller and smaller due to the military campaigns and empire-wide construction projects that the Khan pursued. Any attempt to rebuild the treasury was met with corruption or political scandals. The second invasion only worsened this problem. To cap off this disaster that was the year 1281 for Kublai Khan, his favorite wife would die before year's end, an ill omen for the future. Despite the pressing concerns of the empire's economy, reputation, and military strength, the Khan would launch several more invasions against the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, specifically against the Dai Vet and Champa in modern-day Vietnam, the Pagan Empire in modern-day Burma, and the kingdom of Singhasari on the island of Java between the years of 1283 and 1293. In 1283, the empire invaded Champa, using its navy as a cornerstone to its campaign. Champa was a collective of small kingdoms that ruled over central and southern Vietnam and dominated the sea routes for trade between China and Southeast Asia. Although the Mongols defeated the Champa in battle and forced them into a tributary of the empire, the Champa would wage a guerrilla war for the next several years. Only when the Daivet surrendered in 1288 did the Champa truly agree to become a tributary. Prior to 1285, the Daivet were already a tributary of the Yuan dynasty. This kingdom that controlled northern Vietnam first fell into the influence of the Mongols nearly 3 decades ago. Back then, the Mongols were still waging war against the Song dynasty of China. Seeking to strike at the Song from the south, a Mongol army invaded Daivet. This army captured the Daivet's capital, located in modern-day Hanoi, and forced the kingdom into a tributary state, which in turn removed it as a tributary of the Song and allowed the Mongol army to invade the province of Guangxi in 1259. By 1285, Kublai Khan wanted to extract greater tribute from the Daivet and control its government's affairs. So under the pretext of a reinforcement army being sent via land, the Khan demanded that the Daivet grant passage for his army to reach Champa. Regardless of the Daivet's answer, the Mongols invaded. This second invasion started off with some success, but severe logistical strains and overextension by the army led to a Vietnamese counterattack which routed the Yuan army. Not wanting another failed conquest like Japan, the Mongols would invade the Daivet a third time in 1287. And just like before, it started off well, but by its end in 1288, it fell apart. A fourth invasion was planned, but never carried out due to the Khan's death some years later. Instead, to avoid more conflict, the Daivet and Champa agreed to Yuan's supremacy and became tributaries. Further to the west, the Khan sought to bring the pagan empire into his realm. Prior to the Mongol invasion, the Khan tried diplomacy to force the pagan into becoming a tributary from 1271 to 1273. When this failed, the Khan sent forces to block the borderlands between the pagan and the Song's southern tributaries in 1275. The pagan fought back, but were driven off between 1277 and 1278. In 1281, the Khan attempted one last round of diplomacy, and when this failed, he invaded northern Burma from 1283 to 1285. The invasion was costly but successful. By 1287, the Burmese agreed to tributary relations with the Mongols. Sometime later, the pagan empire would fall apart, and the Mongols sat back and watched. During these wars, Kublai faced internal strife as several rebellions in Tibet and his northeastern territories would occur. These rebellions tied down forces that could have been used in Vietnam, Burma, or Japan, not to mention the strain on resources. These rebellions, however, were eventually put down, giving the Khan the ability to focus on his next conquest, Java. In 1293, the Khan invaded the island of Java. Originally, the invasion was a response to the kingdom of Singhasari refusing to pay tribute and maiming a Yuan diplomat. However, by the time the invasion reached Java, the Singhasari were usurped by the newly formed Kidari kingdom. The Mongols landed successfully and waged a fierce campaign while allying with the local Majapahits. When the usurpers were crushed, the Majapahit betrayed the Mongols, routing their army and forcing them to leave the island. The Majapahit would rise as an empire in Southeast Asia, and this shocking failure for the Mongols would end their ambitions in Southeast Asia. These wars that preceded the failed invasions of Japan showed that after Japan, the Mongols could still wage several wars at a time, but that their military strength, both in the army and navy, were reduced, as well as the fact that the Mongols failed to take the lessons earned in Japan and apply them to these wars. Whether Disease and severe logistical problems hampered these invasions while facing several enemies that learned to counter the Mongol Yuan army effectively. These invasions, which in part were meant to remedy the failure of Japan, only added to that chain of failures or stalemates. They also occupied the Khan and his officials from planning a third invasion of Japan. Such a plan was still in its early stages when the Khan would soon die. Thus, the immediate consequences of the Japanese invasions, which had a hand in the invasions of other Asian kingdoms, inadvertently prevented a third invasion from ever taking place. Not only this, a growing belief in the Chinese courts was that due to the Japanese being extremely brave and violent, any invasion of Japan was futile. This belief would carry over into the Ming Dynasty of China, who would discuss three separate plans of invasion, but were haunted by the Mongols' failure, and never went through with any of them. Despite all of the mild successes and great failures, the economic and political troubles, and the military weakening, the Mongol Yuan dynasty would establish a peace which would last until the dynasty's final years. When his favorite wife died in 1281 and his chosen heir in 1285, the Khan grew despondent. The overall failures of his invasions, the slow rise in corruption and economic troubles drove the Khan further away from his duties. He would soon fall ill in 1293 and die on February 18th, 1294. He was succeeded by his late son's own son, Timur Khan. Timur was left to pick up the continent-wide problems from his grandfather. He succeeded in ending conflicts and reaffirming tributaries, but the corruption in his empire grew severely. After Timur, the following emperors would leave their own mark on the dynasty. They introduced new positive reforms for the economy, law, and politics, but at the same time added to the growing problems the Japanese invasion had enhanced. China was put under severe debt. The court faced popular discontent. Mongol elites grew angry. Hundreds of officials were executed, and rebellions, coups, and civil wars soon took place. All of this came to a head in the dynasty's final years as famine swept the land and natural disasters like droughts and floods ravaged the countryside. Everything that preceded the invasions of Japan led to one final rebellion. In 1351, the Red Turban Rebellion began. The rebellion was led by Song loyalists who sought to not only get revenge against the Mongols but re-establish the Song dynasty. In 1354, the Mongol Yuan army marched to finally put down the rebellion, but the last Yuan Khan, Toghon Tumir, dismissed its commanding general. This act, which was done with a fear of betrayal by the general and to restore Toghon's own power, led to the collapse of the central government. With no central army, Toghon had to rely on warlords to end the rebellion. But as the war dragged on, Toghon gave up on the politics of the empire and eventually was forced to flee north to his summer capital of Chengdu in 1368, when the newly formed Ming army of Zhu Yuanzhang's Ming dynasty marched on the regular capital. Zhu was a former general of the Red Turbans who gained absolute power after the Song's own emperor died during the rebellion. 1368 marked the end of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty. What remained of the Yuan and their loyalists would form a weak state in Mongolia called the Northern Yuan dynasty. They would never rule China again, despite resisting the Ming in northern China up until 1387. Although it was nowhere near the main reason for the Yuan's collapse, the failed invasions of Japan were undoubtedly a sign that the Mongol Empire was slowly coming to an end as it began to face many struggles externally and internally, economically and militarily, politically and socially. To put it simply, the Mongol invasions of Japan and their aftermath were one cut of 1,000 that killed the Yuan dynasty. For the Japanese Kamakura Shogunate, their great victory over the Mongol invasions would lead to its own demise. In the immediate aftermath of the invasions, Japan began to change. Militarily, the invasions were a wake-up call to the samurai. Their mounted archery, individual-focused battle tactics were outdated. And though it would take years and decades following the invasions, the Japanese would reform their armies, adding an infantry component to them. These soldiers would be spear-armed conscripts that one day would evolve into the well-known Ashikaga. Battlefield communication was improved by way of banners, war drums, and shell trumpets. Castles would be better fortified in the future, and for a short while, a standing army in the capital would stay raised, waiting for a third Mongol invasion that would never come. Spiritually, the people of Japan began to see that Japan was favored by the gods due to the seemingly divine storms that destroyed the invaders. The first myths about the storms being divine intervention began to be created. The word kamikaze, or divine wind, was created to define these storms. Many monks and samurai say their pre-war prayers were answered. Celebrations were held in many places, and some years later, the shogun would issue nationwide prayers for this occurrence. And socially, the first wave of anti-foreigner sentiment was birthed, although only a minority of people felt this way. A more serious, immediate impact of the invasions was on the shogunate's treasury. The invasions crippled the shogunate financially, as keeping soldiers ready for a third invasion was expensive. So too was the defenses of the actual two invasions. Matters only worsened when accounting for the temples and the samurai. What money the shogunate could spare was given to the temples that provided prayers for victory, and to the samurai as their reward for defending against the Mongols. However, for the samurai, this wasn't enough. The system of payment and rewards for the samurai's services in war was a major aspect of the shogunate's soon-to-be demise. You see, during war, the shogunate called upon the samurai clans to send their warriors to war. In turn for their service, once the war was concluded, the shogunate was obligated to reward the samurai. The most valuable and expected reward was land. Land to rule, to cultivate, and pass down to their families. In the past, this system worked without issue, as the wars were always within the shogunate's domain. But what do you do when the war is with an external threat? One that you cannot conquer. The Mongol invasions were a defensive war. There was no new lands conquered, no new lands to reward the samurai. The shogunate did all it could have done, rewarded them money, titles, and other things, but these rewards were not land. The samurai became disgruntled. If the shogunate could not give them the rewards they deserved for fighting the invaders, then what good was it to serve the shogunate? To make matters worse, the shogunate's image of fairness and justice was tarnished by decades of corruption. The authority of the shogunate was in steep decline. Japan was becoming a powder keg, and all it needed was a single spark to ignite it. The spark would come with the reign of Emperor Go-Daigo. Go-Daigo started his reign as emperor in 1318, nearly 4 decades after the end of the Mongol invasions and 24 years after the death of Kublai Khan. Unlike many other emperors in the past, Go-Daigo came to power in his 30s. This meant that he was unable to be influenced or swayed by the shogunate. Full of ambition, Go-Daigo sought to restore imperial power and destroy the shogunate. Go-Daigo took a slow and cautious approach to his scheme. He focused first on consolidating his power before gathering and making allies. In 1321, he persuaded his retired father to relinquish his power, making Go-Daigo the most powerful emperor within the Kamakura period. Following this, he encouraged anti-shogunate groups within the court, one of which was discovered in 1324 and its leader sent into exile. Luckily for Go-Daigo, his connection to this group was still hidden. For 7 more years, Go-Daigo built alliances within the court with disgruntled samurai and the temples. Soon, he would be ready to make his move. Unfortunately for Go-Daigo, he would be betrayed, but this betrayal would spark, at first, the Genko incident, which would evolve into the Genko War and the end of the Kamakura Shogunate. In 1331, the Genko incident was kicked off when one of Go-Daigo's advisors betrayed him to the shogunate. Go-Daigo was forced to flee Kyoto. However, he was soon captured and then exiled to Oki Island, which was located north of the main island, specifically north of the city of Matsu. Despite exiling the emperor and replacing him, the shogunate inadvertently started a war. Go-Daigo's son, Prince Morinaga, rallied his father's allies. Samurai rose up in rebellion, and the samurai named Kusinoki Masashige launched a guerrilla war against the shogunate. The Genko War had begun. In the hopes of regaining control, the shogunate ordered Ashikaga Takauji to lead an army to crush the imperial loyalists, but he would never do so. Whether it was loyalty to the emperor, hatred of the shogun, or personal ambitions, Takauji betrayed the shogun and joined Go-Daigo's side. Go-Daigo was no longer in exile. Kyoto was captured, and most importantly, the shogun suffered a second betrayal. Nita Yoshisada rebelled in the east and attacked Kamakura itself. By 1333, the Kamakura Shogunate was on its last legs, with Kamakura itself on the verge of siege. The Hojo and Minamoto leaders of the shogunate committed seppuku. The Kamakura Shogunate was undone, and with it, the Kamakura period of Japan was at an end, and a new order would rise to replace it. Although it would take decades of building tensions, corruption, and the choices of ambitious men, the catalyst for the fall of the Kamakura started with the end of the Mongol invasions. If they had never occurred, the Kamakura would have continued to reign in Japan for at least another century. With them, the Kamakura is destroyed, and a new period of Japanese history began. Victorious, Go-Daigo reclaimed the throne from his shogunate replacement, Emperor Kogan. With his restoration, a new short age began, the Genmu Restoration of 1333 to 1336. Go-Daigo's first steps with his newly regained power was to reward Masashige, Takauji, and Yoshisada for their help in overthrowing the Kamakura. Once this was complete, Go-Daigo began consolidating power into the imperial court and other stations, sapping away the warrior class's influence. However, he faced a great challenge of changing the shogunate-style status quo with an imperial one from nearly 2 centuries ago. How would governance fare without the shogunate? How will the warriors react? Would they get paid? Instead of a gradual evolution away from the previous government, Go-Daigo's ambition led him to rapidly try and change the nation. His gravest mistakes were cutting ties with Takauji, dismissing the warrior class, and not rewarding them lands. Another powder keg. In 1335, Hojo remnants rebelled, seeking to restore their lost power. Takauji requested permission for the title of Seitai Shogun and to lead an army to crush the rebels. Go-Daigo denied this request as his son was given the position already. Despite this, Takauji gathered his own army and marched east without permission. Takauji crushed the rebels and established his own power base at Kamakura. Another samurai uprising. Takauji marched toward Kyoto. Yoshisada was sent to stop him, but was defeated in the Battle of Hakone Take no Shita in early 1336. Once again, Go-Daigo is forced to flee Kyoto. Takauji occupies the city but is forced to retreat soon after. However, Takauji's base at Kamakura had already fallen to loyalist forces, forcing him to retreat to Kyushu. After several months in Kyushu, gathering strength and receiving the blessing of the retired Emperor Kogon, Takauji marches on Kyoto again. Yoshisada and Masashiga marched against Takauji, but were decisively defeated in the Battle of Minatogawa. Masashiga was forced to commit seppuku, and Yoshisada, who escaped the battle, would be killed 2 years later. For a third time, Go-Daigo flees, and for a second time is forced to submit to the warrior class. A new emperor is placed on the throne and grants Takauji the title of Seitai Shogun. Thus, a new shogunate is established, the Muromachi Bakufu, or the Ashikaga Shogunate. Named after the street, the Ashikaga's mansion resided in Kyoto. The Ashikaga would have their power base in the capital itself. The Muromachi period, which would last from 1336 to 1573, had begun. However, unlike the Kamakura Shogunate, the Ashikaga Shogunate would be plagued by periodic wars and ineffective leadership as the decades and centuries passed. Within the first year of its reign, Go-Daigo fled south and established his own imperial court to resist the shogun. Decades of war ensued between the loyalists of the northern court in Kyoto and its shogun, and the southern court with Go-Daigo and his family. This period of conflict was known as the Nanboku Cho, and would last from 1336 to 1392, when the third Ashikaga shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, reconciled both courts. This sub-period created great instability within the country, perpetuating and normalizing violence, transferring power to the samurai in the provinces, and prevented the shogunate from having complete authority over the nation. Go-Daigo, who died in 1339, had helped usher in a new shogunate and a new period of destabilization that would lead to dire consequences in the centuries to come. After Yoshimitsu, every shogun would become more and more distant from their duties. All of this foreshadowed and eventually led to the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war. To put this story to a close, the Mongol invasions of Japan had profound impact on the history of both China and Japan. What started as one empire trying to conquer another led to the fall of dynasties and the birth of new ones. New wars and uprisings would be waged, new ambitious men would rise, and history forever changed. With that, the story of the Mongol invasions of Japan is over. We've seen the rise of two empires, their spectacular clash against each other, their downfalls from power, and those that rose from the aftermath's embers to replace them. I hope you all enjoyed today's Bookends chapter and the history behind Ghost of Tsushima as much as I did. Until next time, this is Ghost, signing out.